Hi, everybody. This week we're going to cover reasons for belief and doubt. And this chapter is going to be different from the previous chapter in that the reasons for believing something isn't given in argument form. Rather, it's about giving reasons by directly presenting evidence. Now, of course, one way you can stretch the word evidence is by giving a deductive argument or an inductive argument. That's what the previous week's lesson was about. But this week, we're going to talk about giving reasons that don't involve anything as formal as deductive or inductive arguments. So as you'll notice, the topics in this week's lecture begins with claims without arguments, and basically what to do in terms of determining when a claim should be accepted and when a claim should be rejected. So all these topics that are going to be covered in this week's lecture, so what happens when claims conflict, where do you go to back up the credibility of a claim, experts or one's personal experience, some of the difficulties that might arise when we look to ourselves for evidence and when we're fooling ourselves and things of that sort. That's going to be the topic of this week's lecture. Okay, so I'm on the top of page 2 of our lecture notes, and the topic is claims and evidence. And as with the previous lectures, I'm not going to read through the lecture notes because I'm going to assume that you'll do that on your own. I'm just going to highlight certain concepts that I would normally highlight in a class lecture that don't come through in the lecture notes directly. So one of the first things that you should notice about believing or doubting a claim is that it comes in degrees. It's not, in other words, an all or nothing affair. So some beliefs have greater credibility than others. So we can think about this idea as being representable on a scale. Let's say that here it's the most unbelievable, and here it's absolutely certain. And basically, beliefs are going to range anywhere from this to there in the continuum. Some beliefs are where, let's say, in the middle, where you just can't choose one way or the other. They are the ones where you should suspend either your belief or disbelief. But things that are certain might be things like 2 plus 2 is 4. Things that are absolutely unbelievable would be things like, unfortunately, that Santa Claus exists. That's completely unbelievable. And then there are a lot of things that kind of hover in this range. And the discussion of this week is dealing with the complications of claims that lie anywhere on this continuum. Now, the other thing that you should notice is there's a general principle. It might seem to be common sense, but the principle is that a good critical thinker is always going to proportion their belief to the evidence. And that's basically a very fancy way of saying that you're going to believe something as being more certain, in other words, on this end of the spectrum, or less certain, depending upon what the evidence is and how much evidence you have for it. So let's take an example. So here's a claim that you might think has a great deal of support. Let's take the claim that there are palm trees in Los Angeles. So I'm just going to represent that claim as this. There are palm trees in Los Angeles. I would say that a belief that there are palm trees in Los Angeles comes pretty close to that end of the spectrum. And it's because we can see that there are palm trees with our own eyes. Other people who say that there are palm trees are pretty reliable, and there are many reliable people who claim the same thing. Now let's take a different claim, the claim that there are UFOs, and I'm going to represent that claim with just the letter U. The claim that there are UFOs, I would say, is more either along the middle line where you just can't determine it one way or the other, or more along the lines of it being less credible, primarily because it's doubtful that you've seen something that you can call a UFO with your own eyes, and the people who claim that they have seen UFOs aren't as reliable as people who claim that they see palm trees. So that's just an example of proportioning your belief to the evidence. The more evidence that you have for a belief, like this one, the more credibility it has. The less evidence, like the claim that there are UFOs, the less you should believe it, the less confidence you should have that that belief is true. So now the question is, what are the acceptable forms of evidence? What do we look to give us evidence that something is true? As I said before in the previous chapter, we can stretch the word evidence to include arguments. But arguments are not the only forms of evidence. We also have our own senses. We also have testimony, in other words, what other people say. And we also have various other variations of testimony, like the news and various different kinds of forms of news. In other words, news that comes in newspapers, print news, as opposed to television or cable news, and so on. And in this chapter, we're going to go over some rough rules of thumb. These are not strict. These are rough rules of thumb that are more like guiding principles. And by rough rule of thumb, I mean that it's not something that you would obey under all circumstances at all times. So it's not like the rule that 2 + 2 is 4. It's not like the rules of mathematics, which are hard and fast. Maybe they're like the rules of, I don't know, maybe you might think etiquette. Things you should do in order to be kind or polite. There are rules of thumb about how you can be kind and polite, but none of those rules can you say that they're always applicable at all times. Okay, I just want to emphasize that this chapter addresses some very important ways in which we deal with information in our society, information that could influence how we conduct our lives in a very important and meaningful way. So, for example, there was a controversy, I don't know if you're aware of it, there was a controversy about whether vaccines caused autism. And for a while, a lot of people, and a lot of intelligent people, believed that vaccinating your child had chemicals in it that would cause the child to become autistic. But it turns out that this claim that vaccinations cause autism turned out to be completely untrue. In fact, it was based upon a falsified study that the author of the study pushed forward through dishonest means, and now what we see currently, as I speak, is a rise of certain diseases that we thought were eradicated 50 years ago. So if you're not an expert in immunization and you're not a doctor, what do? You have to go to some source of evidence to know whether or not to do something as important as vaccinating your child or not vaccinating your child. And so I just want to emphasize that the contents of this chapter could matter greatly to how you get informed in ways that are going to shape your life. So first things first, what do you do when you get conflicting claims? What do you do, for example, about the claim that vaccinations cause autism or the claim that vaccinations do not cause autism? Well, in most cases, you would see how credible the sources are for the pro-autism view and how credible the sources are for the non-connection view. But when there's really no evidence supporting either one of the two conflicting claims, in other words, you don't even have any evidence that something that A leads to B, let's say, whatever that A and B might be, then basically you have to say, and that's a question mark there. Basically, you're going to have to say that you don't know whether the claim is to be accepted or not accepted, and you're going to have to be in a state of not believing one or the other. In other words, a question mark. And a question mark, you might think, might be a wishy-washy way out. Actually, that's not true. It's the responsible way of responding to a claim where you have no evidence supporting it, but you also don't have evidence that disqualifies it. So if you're in a situation of that kind, then the most responsible thing to do is to say you just simply don't know. Now, hopefully that's going to happen rarely. Hopefully you're not going to come across too many claims in your life, or too many important claims, rather, where you're going to have to say you suspend your belief or disbelief one way or the other. But most of the time, we come to evaluate claims in the context of what's called your background information. And this is just a very fancy term for saying, everything that you know about how the world works as well as you know it. So what's included in your background information might be things like the Earth revolves around the sun. It gets pretty hot during the months of July and August when you're in Los Angeles. Things like penguins live in the Arctic. So the things that you learn at school, in elementary school, the things that you observe about people and their behavior, this is all a part of your background information. And, probably the older that you get, the richer and possibly more accurate, hopefully more accurate, your background information becomes. But most of the time, when you evaluate a totally novel claim, let's just make that C, a totally novel claim, you're going to determine whether or not this is on the believable scale. Let's go back to that scale again that I drew before, where something is, you should definitely believe it 100%, that's up here, or you should definitely reject it, that's down there. This is, you just don't know, it's in the middle, question mark. And I'm saying that whether a claim belongs anywhere on the scale is going to mostly be determined by the background information that you work with. Okay, so I'm now on the top of page 3 of our lecture notes, and there's a principle about how you can use your background knowledge to evaluate a totally new claim. So if a claim appears to conflict with your background knowledge, in other words, other claims you have good reason to believe, then that is some kind of evidence that the claim is doubtful. So this is a rule of thumb, a rough principle. I'm going to look at the example that's given in the text. So suppose somebody says that the Earth is flat. Now, as a part of our background knowledge, we've learned from a pretty young age that the Earth is not flat. People used to believe that it was flat, but we know pretty well that the world is a globe and it's not like a sheet of paper, which is flat. Part of what I want to emphasize with this example is that what's considered common knowledge or common sense, it's a part of what's generally considered a part of the science, the accepted science at the times. So what might have been common knowledge 500 years ago is going to be really different from what's considered to be common knowledge today. So I just want you to understand that what's considered common knowledge or background knowledge is going to change for a person over time. So as you get older, your background knowledge is going to broaden. But it also changes for a society. And you have to be open to the possibility that what you thought was common knowledge could be actually incorrect. So this is why, again, I want to emphasize that this is not a hard and fast rule. It's only a rough rule of thumb. So probably the wisest thing would be to evaluate new claims given your background knowledge or what's considered common knowledge in the society in which you live, but not be so wedded to common knowledge and to recognize that your common knowledge or background knowledge could be fallible or incomplete. Now, usually when you come across a claim that you don't know how to evaluate, you're going to appeal to experts. And experts come in a number of different forms. And we're actually lucky to live at a time where it's pretty easy to access expert opinion on the internet. Although that in itself, if you're not doing that carefully, could give you wrong information. But one of the things that you want to look out for is when experts themselves disagree about a claim. When the experts themselves disagree about something, then we have pretty good reason to be in the position of being in doubt. To determine whether someone or some source is an expert, you have to look at some of the signs of expertise. And this is about being an expert in a field. So we're going to talk about the expertise of a particular individual. One of the signs is their education and training, and not just their education and training in terms of how much time they've spent in that area, but where they get their degree from. Another is how good of a track record they have in their field of expertise. Also, reputation that they have among their peers. In science, for example, scientists are judged by other scientists and get recognition in the form of publishing journal articles in their particular fields of expertise, and that's also included in their personal accomplishments. One of the things that I would like to add in this vein is, as I said, we now have a very extensive array of internet resources that we can use whenever we have a question about, say, how to treat anything from how to treat the symptoms of a cold to where you should apply to college or what kind of car to purchase. There are a lot of sources out there on the internet that you can use to give you even greater information in terms of making the best decisions or in terms of gauging whether something is credible or not credible. And the things that are said here about gauging expertise in an individual would also apply pretty easily to internet sources. So I know that internet sources like Wikipedia don't necessarily themselves have education or training. However, there are people who post on Wikipedia and update it, and those people themselves are people whose reputations you can do research on to see whether or not what they say is accurate or believable. One of the things that you have to be careful about is to make sure that you use an expert for her area of expertise. You can't ask, for example, this is a trivial example, you shouldn't ask a dentist about what to do with arthritis, because dentists aren't always that good when it comes to dealing with arthritis. Likewise, it wouldn't be a good idea to ask your orthopedic surgeon about dentistry, because that goes beyond their field of expertise. So you need to make sure that you ask an expert in their field that they're an expert in. Also, you should recognize that experts are human beings. And as human beings, even experts can be biased. So, in order to determine whether or not an expert is biased, you often have to do some intensive investigative research on your own. An expert can be biased, for example, by their own religious convictions, or if they have financial pursuits that are, or that might be influencing their views. For example, one of the big scandals that people are worried about these days is the way doctors prescribe medication. There was a time when pharmaceutical companies would go to doctors and persuade doctors to use their pharmaceuticals, and doctors would be given a cut of the, or not necessarily directly a cut of the drug sales, but they'd be given very lavish dinners, or would have other kinds of financial rewards for prescribing the medication that the pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing. A medical doctor doesn't do research in drug manufacturing. That's what pharmaceutical companies do. So even though you might go see your doctor about a medication, there could be some dangerous instances where your doctor might be motivated by financial rewards in prescribing a drug. And these are things that are very difficult to find out. These are things that are very difficult to determine on your own, which is why a lot of people, especially when they are getting medical advice, want to get a second opinion. And it's always a very good idea to get a second or a third opinion, just to make sure that if there is bias in one individual, maybe that bias might not be carried over to the individual who's giving you a second opinion. So we're on page 4 now, and I want to discuss signs of dubious authority. In other words, signs where somebody who's posing as an expert is actually revealed to not be an expert. So one of the signs that somebody is not an expert in their field is if they start making certain very factual or what's called formal errors. Formal errors are like errors of arithmetic or errors of deductive reasoning. If they're not good at that, then they're not really trustworthy. Another is when they don't back up the claims that they say they're an expert in, even though they're given an opportunity to do so. If they avoid it, then that's a sign that they might not really know what they're talking about. Another sign that somebody is not an expert in what they say they're an expert is, in other words, they're lying about their expertise, is when they start contradicting themselves, when they start saying one thing and then saying something that's completely at odds with what they originally said. Another big sign that they're not an expert is when they don't treat opposing views fairly. In other words, they just dismiss opposing views without giving them thoughtful consideration. And in other words, they tend to be dismissive and they show emotion in their dismissing of a claim, making you all very suspicious that the person isn't being fair-minded and not an expert. Also, if somebody is relying on information that you know is out of date, then they are probably not going to be a good expert to rely on. And another sign that somebody is not an expert is if the peers in their field generally disagree with what this alleged expert is saying. Of course, this is really hard to gauge because, first of all, if you're not in the field, you don't necessarily know who the peers are. But just to give you an example, if somebody says that they are an expert in, say, biology, and they dismiss the theory of evolution, even though the theory of evolution is adopted by almost all practicing biologists in all the leading universities, then you need to think twice about whether this person's claims about evolution can be believed. Now, one final thing that that should be mentioned about the use of experts is that all experts have limitations, not only within their own fields of expertise, but there are some fields where not even an expert is to be trusted. So, for example, when it comes to things like morality or politics or religion, even though somebody might be a brilliant scientist or somebody might be a brilliant religious leader, a very respectable religious leader, even they might not have all the truths about what's moral, what's politically right, or what is the right religion. In other words, I'm saying even though you might think that the current pope is very admirable, he might not be the best quote-unquote expert in terms of determining questions about religion, because obviously the Pope has a very specific and committed view about Catholicism being right, and you might not get the most unbiased opinion if you want to talk to the Pope about whether you should believe in God. Likewise, even though you might think that a certain politician who happens to be, say, a Democrat is a very respected politician, that doesn't necessarily mean that being a Democrat is the best political view. Same with Republicanism. So even though there might be people who are leaders in certain fields in, say, morality, politics, and religion, as well as other fields like in science and medicine and technology, academia, etc., certain issues are things that you have to decide as an individual on your own. And another reason why you want to do well in critical thinking is so that you can one day come to some resolution about these big questions on your own and not be a slave to the views of somebody else, and just be lazy in not having to decide answers to these tough questions on your own.